Chris é considerado o pai do SVG. Além disso, é diretor técnico no W3C e coautor do PNG. Foi coeditor do CSS2, liderou o grupo que desenvolveu a Fontface e ajudou no desenvolvimento do WOFF. Atualmente, Chris trabalha no CSS nível 3, 4 e 5, Web Áudio e WOFF2. Com essa bagagem, ele pode ensinar algo para os participantes da BrazilJS 2016, não é mesmo?
Okay, good. Let's get started. So, you've just had a talk about web fonts, and now I'm going to give you a talk about web fonts. Don't worry, it's not a complete rerun. Really, the previous talk told you about what typography is, why you would want it, and what I'm going to tell you is how to get it. So, first of all, that's me with a rather more crappy presentation slide than that nice video one. But hey, so this is me. What have I done? Well, that's my job title. I'm a technical director at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. And I started SVG. In other words, I got all the people together who were competing, and I got them in the one room and said, we're going to have one standard on the web, and it's going to do vector graphics, because I say so, and that worked. So we got SVG, and also I was one of the authors of PNG. I was involved in CSS for a long time. I was the chair for the first 5 years, and I'm currently working on CSS3 color, CSS4 color, and stuff like that. More relevant to this, WebFonts. I chaired the group that produced @fontface, the actual syntax that we did that. Unfortunately, we didn't at that time have a reliable way of downloading the fonts, so we had a syntax, but we didn't have a thing that you could actually download. So I was later on involved in WOF1 and currently in WOF2, which is the format that you can actually download. And lastly, Chromatic fonts, which I will tell you about in good time. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, I want to cover some basics. It really helps to have the right terminology to express things crisply, otherwise people tend not to understand. And I find there's the same mistakes over and over again, that people don't quite understand what the terminology is. So I'm going to do that. It's a little bit boring, but don't worry, it's not that bad. Then I'm going to talk about these OpenType features, which Helen just mentioned. Not only what they are, but how to use them. A little bit about performance. Not that much, because actually her JavaScript stuff about font loading API was pretty good. Everyone liked that, right? All this, putting a class and figuring out when it was downloaded and stuff. And that, good. And lastly, some crystal ball gazing about the future, because I have a crystal ball, actually. So, basics. And now you know what this image is, right? You know this is metal type that was used in the printing press. Good. So, a character is the first thing. What is a character? It is a number, it's a code point, and it has properties like it is an uppercase letter, it is a numeral, this sort of thing. And this should be distinct from a glyph, which is the visual representation of characters. So when Google is looking at your website and indexing it, it doesn't care about glyphs at all. All it looks at is characters. Characters are what you search for when you're typing. But when you're actually reading a site, what you're looking at is glyphs, and you can't see the characters. You can't see them directly, they're just numbers. All good so far? Yes? Good. There will now be a test. So, this thing. First of all, what are you looking at? Are you looking at a character or a glyph? A glyph, good, yes. How many characters are there? 2. Excellent. How many glyphs? Excellent. You've all won. Yeah, good. What about this one? How many characters? 1. Any other answers? Yes. It could be 1, which is what's called a precomposed. In other words, it's an e-acute, which is fine for languages like French. Does Portuguese have e-acute? Yes? Yes, it does. Okay. So for common languages, this is fine, but there are also minority languages that have all sorts of weird accents, and you can't basically have all of them. They're not encoded as characters. So you can also have a thing called a combining accent that says, I'm an accent, and I don't do anything until you put a letter next to me, and then boing, they fit together. So it could be 1 or 2 characters. And it is 1 glyph, And here's the trick question. It could be either one or two fonts. You can actually get the combining accent from one font and the base letter from another font, and if you do, you'll know because it looks ugly as hell. Okay, so now some more terminology. Here's some examples of fonts. Myriad Pro there is a font family, as is Baskerville. And these are faces, the light, the Roman, the bold, the italic, the condensed, etc. Fonts vary as to how many faces they have, but they're all in the same family. So that's a pretty easy piece of terminology. Now, properties and descriptors. So everyone here has used some CSS, right? You've written some CSS. You know what a property is? Yes? Good. Okay. And if I said to you descriptors, would you know what those are and how they're different? No. So here is an example. I've got font weight bold, and later on I also have font weight bold. But one's in a font face and one is just in a style rule. The ones in font face are descriptors, where their job is to say, here's a font, you can download it over here, this is what it does. It's a bold, it's an italic, whatever it is. Whereas on the rule here, what it's saying is, in my headings, I want them to be italic. Find me a font that's italic, or find me a font that's bold. Right? So one of them is requests, and one of them is descriptions, and the browser matches them up to produce the best thing for what you actually asked for. Are we clear on that one? Good. I've just said that. Font stacks. So when you actually ask for a font family, typically you ask for more than one, and the first one is used that actually has glyphs for the character that you want. So here's an example which often people trip up on. So if you ever looked at a Japanese font, for example, if someone sends you an email and they're Japanese, and you notice that it looks hideous because they're writing to you in English, but for some reason it looks really crappy. And that's because the Japanese font is being used and you're using the Latin glyphs and they look awful. How do you avoid this in your own websites? What you do is something like this. You say, here's a font family, you give it some name, and then you combine two fonts into one. You say, well, I've got a Latin one, and then I've got a Japanese one, and you'll load them in that order. So therefore, the first one in the stack will be used. So whenever you have Latin glyphs, you'll use them from the nice font that you like for Latin, and all the Japanese and everything else will come from the second font. Yeah, simple. Is there a problem with that? Can anyone see a problem with that? No? Overlapping code points, yes, exactly. You can't have them both be first. Maybe the person who did the Latin font also put in some kana, because there's not very many of them compared to the kanji, so they put a few in, and they're rubbish because they didn't actually know what they were doing. Then you can't put them both first. How do we solve this? We use a thing called Unicode range. This is a descriptor which says the amount of Unicode code points which you are allowed to use, not what the font contains. It's not a promise about the font. What it's saying is effectively don't use ones outside this range. So here's a nice example. We've got Unicode range with some mysterious numbers there, which obviously you can tell that this is the yen symbol, then it's kanji, then it's hiragana, and that's katakana, and you could tell that just from reading the numbers, right? No. Okay, yes, I have a shameful admission to make to you today. I did design the Unicode range syntax. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and it is a constant source of shame to me ever since. Moving swiftly on, I will show how you can actually use it in practice. So U+26 is the ampersand character, and up above we have this and that, and we've got a nice swashy ampersand. And what we want to do is have that without changing our markup, obviously. We don't want to span class equals ampersand. That would be just hideous. So we have something like this. And the first thing we do is we need to add the Unicode range. And nothing happens because we're not actually using that font yet. Ding! No markup changes, just one simple property. Look, there's the source code. It doesn't have any special spans or anything. So you can get that very easily. It's a very simple thing to do. Good. Now, that's the basics over. We can go on to OpenType features. So OpenType features are optional stylistic controls. They're sort of knobs that you can use to control what a font does beyond its basic performance. And of course, you want to control them with CSS. Helen showed how to do them in InDesign, which is fine if you're producing a print document that you have printed out, but not super useful on the web. So you want to control it with CSS. Now, there's two ways to do this. One is using font variant, which is reasonably self-descriptive. Unfortunately, it has rather poor support at the moment. I don't understand why it has poor support. These slides are online, by the way, so if you see a link, you'll be able to follow it afterwards and see where it goes. This one goes to Can I Use? And there's also font feature settings, which is cryptic, uses bizarre four-letter number things. It's horrible. Unfortunately, it's widely supported. I'm going to do all my examples using font variant because I'm using Firefox, which actually supports that. And I wish the other ones would, because basically they already have the code there. They just need to hook it up. So here's an example. We saw in the previous talk an example of using old-style numbers. So if you look at these two lines of text, you can see that the numbers line up well with the lowercase letters, but on the uppercase ones, they don't look very good because uppercase letters don't have ascending descenders. Now there we can change it to the other value, and now you can see it works well with the uppercase letters and less well with. Obviously, you would set this depending on what if you have a headline that's all in capitals, then you'll set it to lining numbers, and if you have body text, then you'll set it to old style. You use the appropriate one based on what you're doing. So here's another example. If you look in a font, you'll find it often has a glyph for, say, a half or 3/4. But if you want some weird thing like 13/27, you're not going to find that in the font. But you can use an OpenType feature to tell it to make fractions for you, like this. Ding! Suddenly you have these nice fractions. You don't have to type anything, change anything different, just set one property, and it does it for you. So here's another example. So imagine you had a table of numbers, currency or something like that, and you're scanning over these, and you look at this and you say, well, this second number there looks like a big one because it starts with an 8, whereas the other one starts with 1s and 2s, so it must be the largest number. And that's because you're being misled, because the numbers don't take up the same amount of width. Now, you could fix that by setting it all in a fixed font, a fixed spacing font, but that would look really hideous on all the text. So instead, what you do is you change this from proportional numbers to tabular numbers, and then suddenly just the numbers change to be the same width, whereas the letters stay proportional. Again, this is a very easy thing you can do just on a website. Just say table, table.numbers, set it to tabular numbers, and you get an increase in readability for one line of code. Here's another example. So this is using ligatures. This is using quite a lot of ligatures, actually, sort of fancy discretionary ones as well. But you can switch it off. You can set it to normal, which is more normal. You still have the FL ligature. You notice we had that one in the previous talk, the FL. You can actually switch that off as well to none, and then they collide and look horrible. Don't ever do that. It's just, that's one of the values, but you shouldn't ever set it to that. Lastly, there's this thing about fake fonts. So if you download a font and it doesn't have an italic, then the browser will sort of slant it over for you and give you, well, not an italic, but an oblique. It will give you that. And similarly for bold, if you don't have a bold, then it will try and thicken it up, and it looks kind of hideous. Sometimes that's good. I mean, for performance, you might want that. But what CSS does is it lets you have control over this. So this font synthesis property, the default value is, the initial value is weight and style, so it's allowed to synthesize both of these. And we can change it to say, only do weight. So don't synthesize the italic, or only do style, which is the italic, or none. And we can play that with different fonts as well. Let's see what we've got here. Yeah, that one has a bold. That one only has a bold, it doesn't have anything else. So if we set it to weight and style, then it does synthesize the italic there. It means you have the freedom. If the font you're using doesn't have much variation, then you can tell it to synthesize, and if otherwise, you can tell it to not, as you wish. And lastly, let's look at font kerning, which is here set to auto, which is the initial value, and letter spacing. So you should understand the difference between these two. Font kerning looks at pairs of letters and decides where they should be based on not making them collide and making them look like having even spacing. And letter spacing puts space between all of them regardless. So let's see the difference here. If I set that to none, then it turns off kerning. And there's auto, which does whatever the browser does, and there's normal. Now, font kerning normal is what you should set all the time. What it does is it tells the font to use kerning. Unfortunately, different browsers do things differently. Some browsers go for performance, and they switch off kerning, which means the text looks horrible. So auto, you're not sure what you're getting. If you want to get a consistent result within different browsers, then if you set font kerning to normal rather than auto, then they will all do kerning, and therefore you'll get more of a consistency result. And also letter spacing, we can change that, you see. Spread it out, and you can also set it to negative values or go, yeah, you shouldn't really do that ever, but I just did. Okay, performance. Now, this part I'm going to skip over quickly because we actually had that already. Well, some of the things we had already. The first thing you can do with a font to increase performance is to subset it. If you've got some huge big font and it covers, everything, Chinese, etc., and you're trying to display a Portuguese website, then the chances are you can probably subset it and get rid of all that stuff that you're not using. And most of the font libraries will let you do that. They'll give you tools to do that. Getting rid of glyphs you're not using gives you huge savings. Dropping off OpenType tables should be done with extreme caution because otherwise you might find that you break something, and that's quite easy to do. And I've given some link to tools. The font tools is a really good one. It's a command line thing. It gives you a lot of control. Now, WOF1. So the first thing I need to explain to you is the structure of a TrueType font or an OpenType font. They both have the same thing. They're basically a bunch of tables with a directory at the top. The directory has pointers to where these start because it's a binary file. And there's various things here, head and HMTX, which is horizontal metrics, and glyph, which has the actual glyph outline data, and so on. So what WOF1 does is, first of all, it adds some information. It adds a header, and it adds a directory, which is the replacement for this directory. And it needs to add a new directory because every single table is gzipped, all they're individually gzipped, and then concatenated together. It also adds some metadata, which has things like a link to the license. So if you look at a website and you say, well, that's a nice font, but I don't know if I'm allowed to use it. If it's a WOF font, you should be able to look into the license and see whether you can or not, and have a link to whether you can buy it, download it, whatever. We gzipped each table individually for two reasons. Firstly, because gzip tends to like small dictionaries, and that worked well. And secondly, we had this idea that you could download the start of a WOF, and then you could find out which tables you're going to use and download them using byte ranges. It turns out no one ever does that, so that was a bad design. Never mind. So in WOF 2, we did some things differently. So here I'm going to show you the innards of the horizontal metrics table. It has a bunch of stuff. For each glyph, it tells you the bounding box, so the xmin, the xmax, the ymin, the ymax, tells you the bounding box of the actual ink for a particular glyph. So the dot there, the big dot, is the current position, and then you move on to the next dot once you've finished rendering this glyph, so that gives you space on either side. And you'll notice there's this thing called left side bearing, which I got drawn in there, which is the distance between this vertical line and the beginning of the ink, which is exactly the same as xmin. Well, you don't have to store them both, they're the same. So we just throw them all away. In WOF, we throw away all the left side bearings and then say, just copy this other number from here. OpenType and TrueType are designed basically for fast layout. They're designed not to be downloaded, but they're designed to be used in memory fast for text rendering. And that means they have an awful lot of repeated information or this sort of thing, which for transmission, we can get rid of that repeated stuff, or we can say we can recalculate it. So an HMTX table in WOF2, the first thing we do is make it smaller even before we compress it. Another thing we do, so the glyph table has lots of types. It has little 8-bit things, and it has some 16-bit things, and it has various different types of data. And the first thing that we do is divide this into different streams based on type. And then we compress each stream together and then put them all. So that actually gives us better compression. And lastly, locker. Locker is a set of binary pointers to where each glyph starts in the table. Well, we don't care where it starts because A, we're going to compress it, so it's going to start somewhere different. And B, when you uncompress it, you're going to have those pointers anyway because you're calculating them as you uncompress it. So we basically throw away the locker table completely and say, build it yourself when you decompress the font, which again helps with the compression. So there we go, there's WOF2, there's a header, the directory again. Collections, that's a different thing. Has anyone heard of TrueType collections? It's a way of having multiple fonts all in one. For example, if you have, say you have Japanese font again, and you've got a bold, and you've got an italic, and you've got a bold italic, but Japanese doesn't use bold and italic, so all the Japanese glyphs are going to be the same in all those 4 fonts, which is a waste. So if you have a collection, it just says, for the Latin ones, I'm going to use these 4 and then for the Japanese, they're all over here. It's the same as the previous font. That's a nice way of compressing it. So WOF1 didn't actually allow you to use TrueType collections or OpenType collections, but we added that into WOF2, so we can support any OpenType font. The other thing we did was we changed from gzip. So gzip was a good decision for WOF1. The browsers already have it, right? HTTP uses gzip, Ping uses gzip. So the library was already there. But it's not the best compression in the world. Brotli is a much better entropy compression. It's very new, came out of Google's Zurich office in Switzerland. So we use Brotli instead, which gives us even more compression. So here's some examples. This is based on a very large corpus of data. Basically, the entire Google font corpus and the entire monotype font library and the whole of Adobe's font library. So based on that, if we consider the uncompressed font to be 100%, then WOF1 gets you down to 45% of the size. And WOF2 gets you down to 32%. Obviously, the more you compress, the harder it is to get that last incremental gain. So as an example, with WOF2 with TrueType glyphs, then it takes it down to 68% of the size, 25% better than what WOF1 did. Slightly less with CFF glyphs. So there's 2 types of glyphs, okay? There's the original TrueType glyphs, which use quadratic Beziers, and then there's the PostScript style, which use cubic Beziers. And remember I told you that the glyph table, we could sort of do all sort of fancy stream-based things and compress it better. We can't do that with the CFF glyphs, so that's why we get less good compression. The last thing I should point out, so if you're on mobile, then obviously you want to have the smallest things so you get a fast download, right? But you also have to decompress the font. And what we found was if we turned the compression settings up to the max, then the decode time doubled. So your actual time to first render increased. You've got a slightly smaller font, but you spend much longer decoding it. So you have to watch out for that. We've tweaked the settings now so that doesn't happen. Also, the memory for WOF2 is much the same as for WOF1. It didn't take lots more memory. That was a definite concern. We were worried that small mobile devices would be able to use these fonts. So we checked and made sure that works. Okay, so you've already seen this before. But now you know about descriptors and whatever. Let's have a look at this. So on the left, we have some CSS with descriptors for font weight and font style and so on. And on the right, we have the font loading API, which, as you can see, in that object, it has exactly the same things. It has the weight and the style, and they're all one-to-one. If you understand the one on the left, you can understand the one on the right. And then you just add a class, as we saw earlier on the previous talk. Once it's loaded, then it changes a class, and that triggers a font to be used. So you download it first, you display it with whatever the fallback font is, and then once it's downloaded, you redisplay. So let's look at the future. Getting back to history, you can see that originally fonts weren't always used in black and white. Well, this isn't a font, this is hand-drawn, obviously. But yes, it's using red, it's using multiple colors, it's quite interesting. And people were missing their illuminated manuscripts, and therefore they decided to have chromatic fonts so they could do them. No, they didn't. Honestly, that's not the driver. This was why we actually did chromatic fonts. Yes, emoji was the main driver for this. Suddenly everyone wanted it. By the way, if you look at these, you can see the same faces are repeated over and over again, but with different skin colors. So actually, emoji has a skin color modifier, so you can have 5 different versions of the same face. It also has flags. You can see we've got a Brazilian flag there. So there's actual Unicode code points for flags, and also Unicode code points for letters in circles, which you can see there spelling out fonts. So there's various different stuff, but people wanted to have that in color. This is a photograph which I took. There was, at a typography conference, ATypi, there was a guy who had been to India, and he'd seen these sign painters. They actually hand paint lettering and do that sort of thing. I gather that's also something that happens in Brazil, in the Amazon. There's also a tradition of colored sign painting. So this guy asked these Indian people to draw him fonts, and they produced huge rolls of material with these beautifully painted multicolor letters. And he said, "Oh, well, why is it in multiple colors?" Said, well, that's what we draw. That's what it looks like. So he said, "Oh, how can I do this? How can I actually make a font with this?" And the answer is you do it like that. Except that isn't the answer, because this is the sort of horrible way. If you look at the source code, you can see that the text is repeated multiple times, once for each color. We've cheated. This is not how you want to do it, because your search engine optimization will go up the wall because you've got the same text multiple times, and that's a red flag, and you're going to get downvoted, and it's going to be horrible. So don't ever do it like that. This is how you do it in print, right? You put it into Illustrator, and you line it all up, and it looks nice. And nobody ever knows how you did it. All they see is the printed result. On the web, people do know how you do it, and it has actual effect. Okay, so it turns out that there were various ways of doing colored fonts. The most obvious way is to use bitmaps. You can use a ping image or something. Obvious downside to that is what size do you do? You have to do all of them, so you've got multiple copies of this, all at different sizes. Apple did one like that using called SBix, which has multiple raster glyphs, and Google also did another one. These were just essentially quick hacks, I would say, to get colored emoji onto mobile phones as soon as possible. There are also 2 other ways to do it, one of which is to have a stack of true type outlines. So instead of having a glyph having just one outline, it has multiple outlines. That was promoted by Microsoft. And then lastly, there was one using SVG. So have you heard of SVG fonts? Yes. Do you still use them? No. Good. Excellent. Do not ever use SVG. SVG fonts was a short-term hack, right? We were aware that at that time, this is 15 years ago, there wasn't downloadable font support, and what people would do is they would lay out their stuff in Illustrator or whatever, convert it all to curves, looks beautiful, totally unreadable, unmaintainable, you can't update it, it was horrible. So we made a quick hack, basically, which had really poor internationalization, but got us the way. And now we've got downloadable fonts, so you don't ever use SVG fonts. But SVG is quite nice. You can have all these sorts of multiple colors. You can have filter effects. You can have all sorts of stuff. So what SVG and OpenType does is it uses all of the OpenType architecture for how the glyphs work. And then for the actual glyphs themselves, it uses SVG. So this is an example of an editor called TransType, which actually supports all 4 of these formats. And we can see what they look like. Here you can see I've brought in these multiple fonts, combined them into one, set some colors, and saved it out. So this is the first one. Color is the palette that holds the true type outlines. And cpal is a palette, so you can say which colors you're using in that font. And then it looks like that. That is a color plus cpal font being displayed in Firefox. So in the actual font, I said that this particular bit has to be dark red and this particular bit has to be orange and green and whatever. Can anyone see a problem with that? Can anyone see a problem with putting the colors in the font itself? That's not how we normally do things, is it? Where did my styling go? I'm used to setting in the CSS what color I want it to be, not having it baked into the font. That would be rubbish. So with SVG, you can actually use CPAL, but you also use CSS variables, which lets you control the color. So the actual SVG uses CSS variables in it, and then in your style sheet, you set these particular names of variables, and they get picked up and fed into the SVG renderer so you can control it. So here's an example, and here's another example. So I can now change these colors like this, see? Doot-de-doot, and there, I can change all these colors and set them to what I want. So that's much more useful. That's much more web-like. We're actually controlling the styling with CSS rather than having it baked into the font. So even more future stuff. CSS4, all of the stuff that I told you about before was CSS3. This is CSS4. CSS4 has a font palette, which will let you, so the fonts can have multiple palettes. For example, you can have a palette which is designed for use on light backgrounds, another one for dark backgrounds, and another one for high contrast for accessibility. And this will let you switch between or choose between the available palettes. More interesting is a way to build your own complete palette. So you could put that in an app font face and say, here's my app palette entries, you give a list of palette colors, and it overrides the baked-in palettes. Font synthesis, I told you about how you can disable fake bold and fake italic. In CSS4, you'll also be able to disable fake small caps. When a browser finds that you've asked for small caps and you don't have it, it basically squashes down the capital letters, which means they look too thick. They don't look good compared to one that's actually designed. So you can tell it to not do that, which means you will just get capitals instead of small caps, but at least they'll look decent. And also, you've got these serif, sans serif. What are the font families? Serif, sans serif, monospaced, Has anyone ever used fantasy in a style sheet? Ever? Yeah. But these ones actually are useful. I mean, the math one says you want math rendering with your particular characters or whatever. Emoji says, hey, look at me, I'm a cool millennial. And Fang Song is a thing which is used for Chinese. It's another thing. It's sort of brush-like strokes in between serif and sans serif, and it was missing for Chinese, so we added it. Okay, so that's me. So as I said, these slides are online. That's the image credits for the images I used and the fonts I used. And that's me. Any questions?